is now safe to extrapolate that Donald Trump killed at least one American in order to instead send the COVID testing machine that might have saved them to Vladimir Putin. Bob Woodward's book does not say Trump sent a terrified Putin COVID-19 tests early in the pandemic, as is being so widely reported. The Washington Post got it right. Trump secretly sent Putin what were then rare Abbott Point of Care test machines for the Russians' personal use. For his personal use. For our enemies' use. From the supply meant for American citizens then faced with a rapidly spreading virus for which there was no vaccine, no cure, and next to no treatment to save Putin and his fellow scumbags, even if that meant Trump would have to kill Americans by remote control. That is the definition of Donald Trump, who, by the way, had already confirmed Woodward's other startling accusation that he has spoken to Putin since he left office. May Donald Trump burn in hell, and the sooner the better. The headline in this nightmare is bad. It's really bad. And the details are worse, because we know with certainty that Trump stole American testing machines from American hospitals and other crisis health facilities, almost virtually out of the hands of first responders, to give to the Russian dictator between two dates, March 31st, 2020 and May 7th, 2020. The earlier date is when the Abbott company says that was when they began distributing our rapid point-of-care COVID-19 tests for our ID Now system, March 31st. 4 days later, Abbott claimed to have distributed 190,000 rapid tests for those machines in 21 American states. That's less than 50,000 tests a day. We don't know how many machines were available at that point. Obviously, the number would be a lot less. So March 31st was the first day Trump could have killed an American for the sake of Putin. The other end of the window, May 7th. On May 7th, officials in Russia and Russia's branch office at the Trump White House said, quote, some COVID testing equipment as well as ventilators had been sent to Russia. But it was Mike Pompeo, the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade balloon, who served as Trump's last Secretary of State, who said that. And he, of course, never said the tests had been pulled out of the hands of American first responders because Putin was scared. The earliest day it could have happened was March 31st. On that day, Doctors Fauci and Birx tried to warn the country that the best case scenario had become between 100,000 and 240,000 American dead. By April 10th, there were more than 18,000 Americans dead, more than 500,000 cases in this country, 160,000 of them here in New York State alone. Our outside date on this window of Trump infamy is May 7th, by which point there were 72,000 dead. 10,000 more Americans would die from COVID in the next week. The latest possible date that someone could not get a test because Trump prioritized Vladimir Putin's life over yours. Just for context, my doctors later agreed I contracted COVID-19 in the first week of February 2020. Fortunately, the worst it got for me was high fever and convulsions. My doctors told me to get a test as a minor case and as a full recovery just in case I showed signs of antibodies, so somebody else could then be prioritized ahead of me whenever the vaccine would become available. I got the test on May 13th. Another American was not so lucky, or another 2 Americans were not so lucky as to get a test. Or 200 Americans, or 2,000 Americans because of goddamn Donald Trump. Deaths in 5 digits as of the first day Trump could have stolen the equipment and sent it to Putin, which is what, figuratively, he did. Deaths increasing by 10,000 a week as of the last day. How many died before all chance of treatment was extinguished just because the Abbott Point of Care machines they needed had been sent to the Russian dictator by the American dictator. Does it really have to be more than one death before we recognize Trump for what he is, before we recognize to whom he belongs, before we acknowledge as a country that what happened here was murder by proxy of an American citizen or citizens by Donald Trump, before we admit that whenever it started and however it started and how recently someone or something in our country was killed or jeopardized by it, that Donald Trump is not just a Russian asset, but that Donald Trump is a Vladimir Putin personal asset. I don't want you to tell anybody, Putin told Trump, according to the Woodward book, because people will get mad at you, not me. Putin was, as always, wrong. If this, out of all of them, the purest and most obvious case of treason committed by Donald John Trump had been revealed in real time in the early spring of 2020, I don't think there would have been an issue of anybody getting mad at Trump. I suspect instead tens of thousands of Americans would have descended on the White House in a blind rage. And we know Trump is still Putin's asset. Woodward quotes an unidentified Trump aide as saying the two creatures have spoken at least 7 times since Trump was exiled from Washington. In early 2024, it's phrased in the Washington Post, the former president ordered an aide away from his office at Mar-a-Lago so he could conduct a private phone call with the Russian leader, according to Woodward's account, unquote. Trump's spokesperson, the comically high-pitched Stephen Chung, called all this, quote, made-up stories by Bob Woodward, unquote, because Chung is both an idiot and a liar. But in point of fact, we do not need Woodward. We do not need Stephen Chung to know for a fact that Trump has been in recent consultation with the Russian psychopath, or at absolutely the best possible interpretation that Trump believes he has been in recent consultation with Putin. In the chaos around the Trump-Biden debate in June, this said by Trump, it got buried. He said he and Putin spoke after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan and before Putin invaded Ukraine.
When Putin saw that, he said, you know what? I think we're going to go in and maybe take this was his dream. I talked to him about it, his dream. The difference is he never would have invaded Ukraine. Never.
The tragedy of our withdrawal from Afghanistan drew to a close on August 30th, 2021. The tragedy of our enemy Putin's attack on our ally Ukraine began on February 24th, 2022. During the debate with President Biden, Trump already confessed to discussing an American enemy's invasion of an American ally before it happened and without transmitting that information to the elected American government. He might as well have been on the phone to Tojo in 1941. Even at this late hour, President Biden should have Trump arrested and detained in a military facility as a foreign agent. It is not merely that Trump is not loyal to this country and does not understand what being loyal to this country or to anything but himself means. It's not just that. It is that Trump has admitted to being in illicit, illegal contact with an enemy dictator no earlier than August 2021, and that there is significant evidence that he has been in illicit, illegal contact with the same enemy dictator no later than January of this year. Were Trump an FBI or CIA agent with such contacts, he and his lawyers could at this moment be negotiating a plea deal so he could avoid the death penalty. A reminder also of who Trump's owner is and what he is trying to do. I'd like to read this part about Putin's threats to use tactical nukes in Ukraine directly as CNN quoted it, having seen Woodward's book, which CNN says recounts a tense phone call between Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and his Russian counterpart in October 2022. Quote, if you did this, all the restraints that we have been operating under in Ukraine would be reconsidered, Austin said to Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, and I hope I'm mispronouncing that, according to Woodward. This would isolate Russia on the world stage to a degree you Russians cannot fully appreciate. I don't take kindly to being threatened, Shoigu responded. Mr. Minister, Austin said, according to Woodward, I am the leader of the most powerful military in the history of the world. I don't make threats. 2 days later, the Russians requested another call. This time, the Russian defense minister dramatically claimed the Ukrainians were planning to use a dirty bomb, a false story the U.S. believed the Kremlin was pushing as a pretext to deploy a nuclear weapon. We don't believe you, Austin said firmly in response, according to Woodward. We don't see any indications of this, and the world will see through this. Don't do it, he said to Shoigu. I understand, Shoigu replied. Trump's friend, the one he sent your COVID test to. Like every other schoolyard bully. Hit him once in the mouth and watch him bleed. Unless you're Trump, in which you kiss him on the mouth. And we don't even know what the implications of the Woodward stories about Trump and the Saudi scumbag prince Mohammed bin Salman are. Quote, Woodward also recounts a meeting that Lindsey Graham, the South Carolina senator, had with the Crown Prince in March. What happened next offers a fascinating window into how the Saudi leader operates and communicates with various world leaders and government officials. Woodward writes that bin Salman had an aide bring over a bag with about 50 burner phones, pulling out one labeled Trump 45. As an aside, I'm sure it'll be easier to confirm this when the book comes out, but it is pretty obvious from the excerpts leaked to the Post, to CNN, and the New York Times that one of Woodward's sources is clearly Lindsey Graham. Hell, Lindsey may have finally snapped. All of these stories could easily be from Lindsey Graham. The Washington Post account ends thusly. The royal court in Riyadh, however, is not the comparison Graham uses when describing visits to Trump's residence at Mar-a-Lago. According to Woodward, the senator invokes an even more brutal form of authoritarianism. Going to Mar-a-Lago is a little bit like going to North Korea. The book quotes Graham as saying, everybody stands up and claps every time Trump comes in. May Donald Trump burn in hell. This Woodward book is not just about Trump and his fellow scumbags. There are Biden parts of this book. They are largely irrelevant, interesting. One part is simultaneously infuriating and endearing. It was after the Hunter Biden prosecution. It could have been earlier than that. It could have been in any of the 500 days of the man in question dragging his feet on Trump. The president told an associate, quote, should never have picked Garland. You're goddamned right. One way or the other. Mr. President, fire this weakling's ass. A couple of other headlines. Now we know what Nate Cohn's message was in his New York Times story Monday about why the Times poll had looked so different from all the others that had been showing Harris ahead by 3, 4, as high as 6. Because the newest Times poll, coming out yesterday, has moved in 1 month from a tie to Harris by 3. Remember the Nate Silver correlation between popular vote margin and chances of a Harris victory outlined here yesterday. 3 to 4%. It's Harris' 86.5% chance of a win in the Electoral College. 4 to 5% is 96.6%. 5 to 6, 99%. 6 points or more, 99.9%. The Times has it at 3. I'm not sure how that correlates to Nate Silver's latest forecast. He claims this is from his model yesterday. And it is that Harris's chance to win the popular vote now stands at just over 3/4. That her chance to win the Electoral College now stands at just under 55%. That her likely vote total in the EC is 279 to Trump's 259. 2 J.D. Vance lies to add to your list. You're going to need a longer list. A dozen clowns in the audience at JV's fascist rally in Detroit yesterday were wearing Auto Workers for Trump t-shirts. The Detroit News spoke to 6 of these, who said they were for Trump, but, surprise, they were not auto workers. Of all the things I don't understand this the most. If you are going to lie, and J.D. Vance is going to lie, it looks to be as pathological with him as it is with Trump. Why not lie skillfully? Why not make sure you've paid these 6 idiots $10 each to not talk to the Detroit News? The other Vance lie, same speech, quote, "You're never going to hear me praise Barack Obama." All right, January 2nd, 2017, New York Times, from contributing opinion writer J.D. Vance. The child who so desperately wanted an American dream with a happy family at its core will feel something different. For at a pivotal time in my life, Barack Obama gave me hope that a boy who grew up like me could still achieve the most important of my dreams. For that, I'll miss him and the example he set. Yes, we will never hear J.D. Vance praise Barack Obama because he didn't read this aloud himself. He let me read it. I'll say it for the 1,000th time. The continuation of our form of representative government is less a function of our efforts to preserve it and more the result of the abject, monumental, incalculable stupidity of those who would destroy it. And thank God they're morons. Which leads me to conclude with this. When you wonder how people could be stupid enough to joke about assassinating the Vice President and President of the United States, while they and others from their own demographic group, which is strung-out megalomaniacs, are campaigning for Trump almost entirely on the near-tragic attempt to assassinate him, if you wonder how they could be stupid enough to joke about this, I wonder instead, which drug? Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson.
Nobody's even bothering to try to kill Kamala because it's pointless. What do you achieve? Nothing.
No, it's totally
Just find
right.
another puppet.
Exactly. That's
It's no point in killing.
it's deep and true, though.
Nobody's trying to kill Joe Biden.
It's
It would be
bless you.
pointless.
Totally.
2 other people who are cordially invited to burn in hell. Also of interest here in an all-new edition, who would be the last person you would select to be your keynote speaker at your event about the future of legacy news media? I mean, there are a lot of choices. Now, I am assuming that the New York Press Club event about the future of legacy news media is not about making sure that it doesn't have a future. On that undertaking, I'm going to suggest that the New York Press Club has literally found the worst person in the industry to give this speech next month. Your clue is, I have talked about this person a lot here, but it is not any of my ex-girlfriends. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
of us on this all-new edition of Countdown. Before we get too close to the election, I wanted to mention my experience with the politician who had the best response to a joke I made about him of all of them I have ever met in 25 years or more of covering politics. This politician often has no sense of humor about others, certainly has a hair-trigger temper, but about himself, he not only enjoyed it, but just last week, in public, somebody made another joke about him, kind of mean-spirited joke as well, and not only did he laugh like hell, he then topped it. He made another joke about himself on the same topic and got a big laugh. Next, in things I promised not to tell. First, there are still more new idiots to talk about. The daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. The bronze, the New York Press Club. The New York Press Club has announced its keynote speaker at its 2024 conference on journalism on November 23rd. Journalism. They don't know what it is. Why should I? Chris Licht, the keynote speaker at the 2024 New York Press Club Conference on Journalism, is Chris Licht. Chris Licht. Why, that's Chris Licht's name. The guy who put the next to last nail in CNN's coffin. The guy who put Trump on live in a town hall and let him lie for 90 minutes. The guy who fired 2 top reporters because he thought they were liberals. The guy who screwed up his only successful primetime show by moving the host, who was a night guy who didn't work well in the mornings and who worked best solo, moving him to the mornings where he had to be one of 3 hosts. The guy who thought the next generation of news meant a different font for CNN's graphics. The guy whose main character reference in a career-ending magazine piece was his personal trainer. You know, the guy who couldn't have done more damage to CNN if he'd still been working for MSNBC. Say, wait a minute. Anywho, Chris, you think I'm licked. You all think I'm licked. The guy who put the next to last nail in CNN's coffin. The last nail in CNN's coffin, that's by the current guy who put their dumbed-down website behind a paywall. Anyway, the guy who put the next to last nail in CNN's coffin after putting nails in the coffin of CBS News, after nearly getting Stephen Colbert's show moved to 12:35 a.m., after turning Joe Scarborough into the most hated person at NBC. Well, to be fair, Joe did most of the heavy lifting on that, but Chris Licht helped. Chris Licht is going to be speaking to the New York Press Club on the future of legacy media? I mean, if what he says is, I'll get your car right now, okay, fine. But if it's not that, or unless there's a moderator standing next to him and when he says, the way for legacy media to move forward is to fire your liberals, then the moderator says, remember, this is Chris Licht, don't do that. And then Chris Licht says, the way to grow legacy media is to ask my trainer for a character reference, and the moderator says, don't do that either. Unless that's the plan, I don't think the New York Press Club could find a worse choice to speak at the Future of Anything conference, even if they thought about it every day through the year 2525. Unless Chris Licht is going to take this opportunity to get up and self-immolate or something. Metaphorically speaking, of course. The runner-up, Joe Kernan of CNBC. Well, Joe might be worse. You know Joe. Joe's the man who wears not one but 2 different ferret toupees on his head, one atop the other. Joe is big mad this week about everything. He complained on air about me suggesting we should follow Trump and Vance's premise and reassess Elon Musk's immigration status and deport him. You know, Musk, the guy making jokes about assassinating Kamala Harris and the President of the United States. That guy, that asshole. That guy who may be here illegally. Joe Kernan also insists Frank Luntz was irresponsible, and this has nothing to do with toupees. He says Frank Luntz was irresponsible in criticizing Trump for Trump's slander of Haitian immigrants in Ohio who were not eating pets. Kernan insists, quote, which they did down in Venezuela. Yeah, they were from Haiti, Joe. Can we just, can we start a GoFundMe to get Joe a globe? Now Joe Kernan and the ferrets atop his head are complaining that Andrew Ross Sorkin said mean stuff about El Trumpolini. Quote, Donald Trump was not convicted of rape in the case involving E. Jean Carroll. A jury found him liable for sexually abusing Carroll and defaming her. Don't you think you should be more careful if you say someone was convicted of rape? Joe, if your defense of Donald Trump is that he was not convicted of rape, that he was only found liable for rape by the judge, you've already lost your argument. Also, about your head, you may want to look into those ferrets. I think I saw one of them move the other day on the air. But the winners, the worst. Joe Kernan's bosses, Cesar Conde and Rebecca Blumenstein, the CYA idiots, not CIA, CYA, who have been running NBC News into the effing ground. The folks who hired Ronna McDaniel in March as a commentator one day and then fired her the next. The latest from these geniuses, MSNBC Films bought the Errol Morris Oscar-nominated, probably, documentary based on the book about Trump's family separation torture policy. The book is called Separated. It seemed like this was a no-brainer, a natural. The book was by the NBC News correspondent Jacob Soboroff, and it was championed on air and off by both Maddow and Chris Hayes. Turns out NBC News chairman Conde and NBC News president Blumenstein bought it to bury it. NBC News, the new home of Catch and Kill. So says filmmaker Morris, they have scheduled the film to premiere in December. Like Judge Merchan. Don't dare criticize Trump before the election when people might be influenced by the film or by his sentence. Wait until afterwards to avoid criticism or retribution or putting yourself on the line, 1/1,000,000%, Cesar Conde and Rebecca Blumenthal. Clowns. Wait until the heat is off. I mean, if Trump loses, you can beat him up then, right? You don't have to come out and take a stand. Stick to the principles of journalism. If you live in Russia and are cowards, or you're at NBC News, where they are not taking any chances anymore. Cowards like Cesar Conde and Rebecca, look at it this way. We're still running it this year, aren't we? What do you people want? Courage? I'm a mindless bureaucrat. Blumenstein, today's worst persons. And this includes Chris Licht. Worst persons. Then to the number one story on the countdown in this all-new edition, and I was thinking about this the other week, and then the story I was thinking about kind of updated. Politicians, generally speaking, do not have good senses of humor. Particularly, they do not have good senses of humor about themselves. There is something, as I've noted previously, to the idea that wanting to be on television and have people listen to your opinions about anything from, I don't know, who should be next president of the United States to which brand of detergent you should use, that this is, in fact, some kind of psychological illness. But if you want to be, say, a senator, a congressman, mayor, governor, president of the United States, head of the United Nations, that may be a far worse condition. Generally speaking, it isn't. There aren't that many Hitlers, although it turns out there are more than we thought. In any event, very few of them get to the positions that they get to by letting jokes be made at their expense. Now, they probably should. The more successful ones probably would be ones who accepted a good joke now and again about themselves. And it's interesting because the politician that I have known of all of them in my time covering it, about a quarter of a century, who took a joke about himself the best is the current president of the United States. This might seem to be in contrast to his reputation, because he swears a lot, as we found out recently, and he swears about other leaders, as we found out recently, and he swears at members of the media, as we found out recently, and he swears at leaders in his own party, as we found out recently. But when I kind of inadvertently and unintentionally made a joke at Joe Biden's expense to Joe Biden face-to-face many years ago, he laughed like hell. I wanted to tell that story again before the election got too close, and then what happens? But last week, Joe Biden made a joke about himself after somebody had made a joke about him. And it was kind of a bitter, cruel joke about him. It certainly was not a good-spirited, hey, Mr. President, we'll miss you kind of joke, ha, ha, ha. It really was an attempt to kick the man when he was down, and his result was, if you have not heard it, good enough to get a big room full of laughter from the people with the worst senses of humor in America, White House reporters.
Craig, have you made a decision on long-range weapons?
Do you want to reconsider dropping out of the race? I'm back in.
Early in 2007, my phone rang at MSNBC headquarters in New Jersey. The senator would like to take you to lunch the next time he's in New York. He needs your advice. Would you be willing to do that? It was Joe Biden's press chief. My first reaction was to ask if they had called the wrong number. My next reaction was to make sure this was not some policy question, because as a news anchor and commentator for MSNBC, it did not seem appropriate for me to offer advice to a candidate for his party's presidential nomination. And doesn't that seem quaint now, Sean Hannity? No, I was told it was more technical, more about communications, less about content. My antique news standards satisfied, I said, sure. And they gave me a couple of dates, and they suggested, given his schedule, the best place for us to eat would be a restaurant in Manhattan. And I laughed and I said, yeah, that's great. It happens to be about 45 seconds from my apartment. The day and the hour arrived. It was March 27th, 2007. And I made it to the restaurant, and I sat down, and moments later, in came the senator from Delaware. He had that big, welcoming smile and equally big, welcoming handshake that you may have seen from back when candidates could still go greet the people in a crowd. He reminded me that we had met briefly when he was in Los Angeles for the 2000 Democratic Convention, and he happened to be staying in the hotel there in which I lived at the time. Senator Biden then said some nice things about my days in sports, and particularly about the commentaries I had begun to do the previous summer on MSNBC. Those special commentaries, he said, with first a smile, then a whistle. There was then, and there remains now, almost no space between the public Joe Biden of the campaign or the presidency and the guy who talks informally to some knucklehead off the streets, which in this story would be me. There might be a few more swear words. The word malarkey was used during our lunch, and I remember that particularly because, as I told him, I went to grammar school in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York, with a kid named Billy Malarkey. He was delighted by that, and he said he assumed we gave the fellow a hard time, and I said, yeah, but not because of the name. None of us third graders knew what malarkey meant. Then why did you give him a hard time? Senator Biden asked. It was the third grade, I deadpanned. Everybody gave everybody a hard time. He liked that answer. But back to the point of the lunch. Your language, he said, in these special comments. Well, people often brought up the language. I used to do things like, telling President Bush to, shut the hell up, because I had to say hell rather than the word I wanted to say. And some of the events of that presidency so infuriated me that I would redden on camera. And I don't redden in a sauna. Once, my high school history teacher, a distinguished and elegant man whose 9 older siblings had been born in Vienna, and who had the courtliness with which that would be implied, mentioned to me the language of the special comments, and I thought, oh boy, here it happens. I'm in for it now. He, Walter Schneller, had told me on the day I graduated that my plans to become a sportscaster were very nice, and he was sure I'd go and do that, but that he was also sure that I would wind up in politics someday, either as a reporter or as a combatant. And I told him, I was flattered, and I will always like you, Mr. Schneller, and you're out of your mind. Mr. Schneller was also the one who years later was put in charge of the school's surprisingly generous fund for bringing in speakers to address the student body. He was very annoyed by the fact that for decades, and he got there in, I believe, 1960, all of the speakers at the Hackley School in Tarrytown, New York, had either looked like, as he put it, Hugh Sidey, the columnist of Time magazine, or they had actually been Hugh Sidey, the columnist for Time magazine. Mr. Schneller began scouring the Northeast for anybody smart who might have a diverse background, and that is how he happened to be driving to the railroad station at Tarrytown, New York, one morning in the year 1991 to meet the train that carried that day's guest speaker at the Hackley School. He was an editor of the Harvard Law Review, and his name was Barack Obama. Anyway, Mr. Schneller and I were talking about the commentaries, and he said, about the language, Keith. And I braced myself and preemptively apologized. No, he said urgently. You missed my point entirely. I'm amazed that your language is so restrained. If I was speaking, I'd have called Mr. Bush a... Whereupon Mr. Schneller made reference to somebody's mother. So, back to lunch. When Senator Biden asked about the language I used, I was wary, but he followed it up by saying that it was kind of why he had asked me to lunch. I watch the commentaries you do. I don't have a choice. Everybody sends me the videos, and my staffers tell me about them. And every time I think the same thing. You express anger, but as close as you come to the line, you never go across it. I say to my staff, folks, is he too angry for you? And they all say, no, just right. So here's my question, and then we can enjoy this great lunch. When I'm passionate about something and I speak on the Senate floor or on the campaign or anywhere else, I get told by my friends and by my enemies, you're too angry. And when I really am angry, they all say, you're really too angry. And here, Joe Biden laughed. Now you go on TV, far larger audience, far longer speeches, and people say, that Olbermann, he's righteously indignant. With a mixture of laughter, astonishment, and curiosity, he said, me? I'm angry. You are righteously indignant. How do you do it? How do you do it, man? Can you tell me? Without thinking, I replied, you've been in the Senate for how long now, Senator? 34 years? He nodded. And you're only just asking this question now? The words were barely out of my mouth when I froze. This wasn't a friend or a colleague or even an athlete who would take the little joking jab I had just thrown. This was a politician. They may have senses of humor, but very few have senses of humor about themselves. In that split second, I was confident Joe Biden would get up and leave. And he was silent for a moment, and then the corners of his mouth turned up, and to my great relief, he burst into laughter. He rocked back into his chair. He slapped the table with a palm. My God, that's funny. More laughter. My God, that's true. Louder laughter. I do not apologize when I say I have loved him ever since. I didn't think I actually would have had much advice for him and was prepared to just go through the lunch having lunch, but as we talked about this topic, he asked me follow-up questions that made me analyze for the first time some of the processes I used unknowingly when writing and reading on television. I had never thought of them before because I had never had lunch with Joe Biden before. I will not bore you with the full results of the dissection of the process or how to turn anger into righteous indignation, if that's really what I was doing. The most valuable conclusion was simply the oldest one in the book. I always wrote late at night while fully angry, and then in the morning, I would take a lot of things out, usually adjectives. Whatever anger was left was only the most intense and the most justifiable. And if you present it 24 hours after you have written it, you will be in control of the anger and not have the anger be in control of you. In short, sleep on it. That was in March 2007. I saw the senator next in August of 2007, a Democratic primary debate officially called the AFL-CIO Candidates Forum, Soldier Field, Chicago, outdoors, 95 degrees, threat of thunderstorms. Obama, Clinton, Biden, Dodd, Richardson, Kucinich, Edwards, and the moderator, me. There are photos of this. Joe Biden and I walking towards each other, hands extended for a greeting. He is literally asking me if I have noticed that he has been trying to turn his anger into righteous indignation. And Senator Biden asking if I thought he had succeeded. They are great photos, largely because my back is to the camera. He did not really succeed in doing this in the debate, though, and he actually came over to me during the commercial and told me what he was going to do, that he didn't think he'd actually gotten the chance to answer a previous question sufficiently, and he was going to go back to it the next time I called on him, and I told him, don't do that. And he did it anyway, and later he let me know he should have listened to me. Since then, I cannot recall him being angry. Not even in those debates with that goddamned madman. The words were harsh, cutting, destructive, fatal. The tone, no. The tone was dismissive, disappointed, slept upon rage. Perfect, A+, no notes. But it occurs to me in all of the analysis of all of the changes in Joe Biden since day one in 1973, nobody touches on this one thing. As late as 2007, he seemed to be, his reputation was as a hothead. When was the last time he was accused of that? I'm not saying I had anything to do with that. But in the years now since January 6th, particularly, it has been a comforting change, and not a change within Joe Biden, but within our presidency. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. We're now back to 5 episodes a week, posting nightly just after midnight Eastern. Once again, there is a Monday countdown. Please send this podcast to somebody who does not know that they need to listen, but who needs to listen. Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel, the musical directors of Countdown, arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards. Mr. Ray was on the guitars, bass, and drums. It was produced by TKO Brothers. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by the best baseball stadium organist ever, Nancy Faust. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2. It was written by Mitch Warren Davis and appears courtesy of ESPN Inc. Other music arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. My announcer today was my friend Kenny Mayne, and everything else was pretty much my fault. That's Countdown for today, 3 weeks and 6 days until the 2024 presidential election, the 1,373rd day since convicted felon drooling J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the election, use the mental health system, use presidential immunity if we have to keep him from doing it again while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is tomorrow, bulletins as the news requires. Until then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck. That was called missing the post.